Hi, so in this presentation I want to talk a bit more about evaluating arguments. And so part of what we'll do is we'll talk about valid forms of deductive argument, what are good structures in argument, and when you see these valid forms, you'll know that they're a good, it's a valid argument. I'm also going to talk a bit about how to evaluate premises themselves. Specifically, we'll talk about moral premises, because what we're going to be focusing on in this class are moral arguments. So we're going to focus, how to evaluate moral arguments today, or at least take a first pass at it. We'll get a lot more practice with this stuff as the course goes on, but I just want you guys to have a basic familiarity with it to start with. Okay, so when we talk about a valid form of argument, it's a form of argument that works. And so one of the easiest forms of valid deductive argument is disjunction. Either A or B, either Trump or Clinton will win the election, for instance. And so with disjunction, well, if one thing is false, it didn't happen, then the other definitely did. So, if you had been in a coma and you wake up and you read that Clinton lost the election, well, then you would know Trump won. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, this argument is really easy. Disjunction is so obvious. Why even spend any time on it? Well, I spend some time on it because there is an associated fallacy. And so a fallacy is an invalid form of argument. It's one that doesn't work, but it looks like it works. So it's often a tricky kind of argument. Sometimes people will use it to trick others, but a lot of times we'll fall for fallacies ourselves. We might even make fallacious arguments and not realize it's what we're doing because they are tricky. They do look like they work. So here, what I want to talk about is the fallacy associated with disjunction, which is the so-called fallacy of false choice. So what the fallacy of false choice does is it arbitrarily narrows down the possibilities. There might be A, B, C, and D. False choice will leave all the others out and narrow it down to A or B. Then what people will usually do is say, well, not A, so we know that B. Now, usually the false choice takes the form of the false dichotomy. That is, there's a lot of choices besides A or B, one or two, but whoever it is narrows it down to those two choices. So here's an example of an argument that commits this fallacy of a false dichotomy. Either the USA should do absolutely nothing about the Syrian conflict, or we should send in troops. We should not send in troops, so we shouldn't do anything. So think about it a minute, why is this a bad argument? Well, it's a bad argument because there are a lot of options between doing absolutely nothing and sending troops into the conflict. We could send in military aid, we could go for diplomatic options, we could arm people. This argument leaves out or excludes all those other options just arbitrarily for no reason. And by doing that, it says, well, it gets its conclusion, we shouldn't do anything about the conflict. If you think about it, false dichotomies are actually pretty common. Usually they'll take two really opposed things and leave out the middle. But that doesn't always happen. And one of my favorite examples of a false dichotomy comes from actually the Colbert Report. I don't know if you guys ever watched it. He loved fallacious arguments. Colbert was a philosophy major. He knew they were bad arguments, but he'd throw them out anyway because they were funny. And one of my favorite examples of a false dichotomy is he had this congressman, Barney Frank, on. Barney Frank was very liberal. This was when George W. Bush was president. And so Colbert asked Frank, he's like, well, George Bush, great president or the greatest president? Barney Frank sputters and grumbles, says, well, I certainly don't think he's the greatest. And so Colbert says, well, so Barney Frank, George Bush, great president. Now, Barney Frank didn't know what to do with this because Colbert's guests generally didn't. But we can see what Colbert's doing, right? Barney Frank thinks there are plenty of options about how good a president George Bush is besides great and greatest. Colbert's narrowed it down to those two possibilities. Whatever you think of George W. Bush, there are a lot of options between great and greatest. Okay, so hopefully you guys have a glue on this false dichotomy. And as with all these fallacies, you might think to yourself, well, if it's this obvious, who would be stupid enough to commit this fallacy? But as we'll see shortly, people commit this one in not so obvious ways. When we get to the argument on drugs in a few weeks, I actually think that David Boaz will fall victim to a false dichotomy. But moving right along. So some more important forms of valid argument have to do with the conditional. If A, then B. If we get a foot of snow the day before class, then class will be canceled. And there are actually a few different forms of argument, a few different valid forms of argument you can make with this conditional. There are also a couple forms of fallacies that you want to be aware of. And so the first and the easiest form of valid argument you can do with the conditional is called modus ponens. I don't know why it's called this. It's the Latin. I don't understand Latin. My high school Latin teacher was actually having a midlife crisis, so, well, I took a couple years of Latin, but I can tell you why his marriage failed. I can tell you why I didn't like being a high school Latin teacher, but I cannot tell you what anything in Latin actually means. Anyway, this is the jargon, be that as it may. So modus ponens, if A, then B, A, so B. So this is pretty abstract. I'll give you guys an example that fills this in. Example of modus ponens. If we get a foot of snow, then classes will be canceled the next day. It will snow a foot Sunday night, therefore class will be canceled on Monday. So if we get a foot of snow, we won't have class. This being Hampton Roads, of course, we wouldn't even need a foot. Probably an inch would do it. My experience, probably even just a really cold drizzle might do it around here. It will snow a foot Sunday night. If it really was going to snow a foot Sunday night, we definitely wouldn't be having classes Monday. All right. So you guys might be wondering why spend some time on this when it's so obvious. Well, the reason is again, there are some fallacious arguments people make with this conditional. And here's an example of a fallacious argument or a form of fallacious argument people often make. If we get a foot of snow, then classes will be canceled at TCC the next day. Classes were canceled at TCC Monday, so we must have gotten a foot of snow Sunday night. Now think about it. Remember, a valid argument is one where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. How could these premises be true and the conclusion false? Well, plenty of ways, right? Maybe Monday is Memorial Day, Monday is Labor Day, Monday is any holiday, right? A hurricane would also cancel classes. Flooding would probably cancel classes. One of my more morbid-minded students, when I gave this example, went straight for nuclear war. Hopefully you guys aren't thinking anything that radical, but yes, if we did in fact have a nuclear war, I very much doubt we'd have class the next day. So you don't know from the fact that we don't have classes that it snowed. You can't go from one to the other. There are plenty of reasons we might cancel class besides snow. So this is a fallacious argument. There's actually a name for this fallacy, and you guys don't need to know the name, but I'll give you the name anyway. I'm not going to quiz you on this. Just do know if you see this form of argument, it's not good, it's a fallacious argument. And so this fallacy is actually called affirming the consequent. So affirming the consequent, if A, then B, B, so A. And look, you can see here why it's a bad argument. Look at what one says. If A, then B, it never says if B, then A, right? So be aware, be on the lookout for this form of fallacious argument. So here's a form of fallacious argument that's actually really similar to the last one, although it's slightly different. So if it snows a foot Sunday night, then classes at TCC will be canceled Monday. It did not snow a foot Sunday, so we'll have class. Well, you can see this is a bad argument because think about the last one. There are plenty of reasons that we might cancel class besides snow. For instance, Labor Day, right? So given that, we don't know from the fact that we don't have snow that we're necessarily going to have class. So again, fallacious argument, you can imagine all kinds of ways these premises could be true and the conclusion false. Now, there's actually, again, there's a name for this particular fallacy denying the antecedent, if A then B, not A, so not B. Again, I'm not going to quiz you guys on the name of this particular fallacy. You just need to know if you see it, it doesn't work. Know that it's a bad argument. I don't really care so much about the jargon as long as you can recognize it as a fallacious argument. So one other thing you can do with the conditional, one other valid form of argument, and actually a really important one, is called modus tollens. So if A, then B, not B, so not A. So the reason this works is, if you have A, you'd also have B. So you can go from the fact that you don't have B to knowing that you don't have A. Well, I'm going to guess that's pretty abstract, so let's make it a bit more concrete, a bit more tangible. Example of modus tollens. If the Hampton Roads region gets a foot of snow, TCC will cancel classes the next day. TCC did not cancel classes today, so we know the Hampton Roads region did not get a foot of snow yesterday. Look, imagine you live in a basement apartment. You know that we might get snow. You wonder, do we get snow or not? You're lazy, so you don't want to go upstairs and look out the window or go outside. So look on your computer, you see that we're having classes. You would know we didn't get the snow. So why is this form of argument important? Well, it's important because you can use it to disprove a principle or claim. I'll show you how. Here's another example, and I think it shows how the argument's modus tollens is useful. If harsh sentences for drug dealers were effective, drug use would go down when we gave longer sentences for dealing drugs. In the 80s, we started giving longer sentences for dealing drugs. Drug use did not go down, so harsh sentences for dealers are not effective. So what this argument's trying to do, it's trying to disprove this claim that harsh sentences for drug dealers are effective. And it does it by saying, well, if they were, then this other thing would happen. It hasn't happened, so that lets us know, that proves that these harsh sentences aren't effective. And so for this reason, this way that it'll disprove certain claims, modus tollens will actually be pretty important as we go through the class. Now again, as with any of these, you don't really need to know the jargon, but you do need to know this is a valid form of argument. You need to know it works. Okay, so one thing that's going to be important in evaluating arguments are so-called implied premises. And what this means is arguments are not always going to say or explicitly state all their premises. Sometimes there'll be a premise that they just kind of assume, even though they don't say it. It's just they expect you to fill it in even though they don't state it. So just to give you an idea of this, let's go with the example the book uses. This is the one from the Vaughan reading that I had you guys do. The use of condoms is completely unnatural, since condoms have been designed to interfere with the natural process of procreation, therefore using them is wrong. Now, you can think whatever you want to about this argument. Even once you fill in the implied premise, it's probably not a great one, but just notice there's a feeling of kind of a gap here. How do you get from it being unnatural to it being wrong? It seems like the argument's changing the subject, right? There just seems to be a jump. That's a good sign that there's an implied premise, a premise the argument assumes but doesn't really state. So here's that particular argument with the implied premise filled in. Use of condoms is completely unnatural. They've been designed to interfere with the natural process of procreation. Anything that interferes with a natural process is wrong. That's the missing premise, that in red here. Therefore, using condoms is morally wrong. So let's actually think a bit more about this concept of assumed or implied premises, missing premises, because it will be important. So look at all these statements, and as I read through them, they all have an implied premise that they assume but don't state. Ask yourself, what is that implied premise? Take a moment, think about them, try to fill it in. So the first one, it is wrong to inflict anything on another person that the average person would find shocking, so torture is wrong. Second one, redistributive taxation takes money from people without their consent, so redistributive taxation is wrong. Third one, the economy did well during Bill Clinton's term, so Bill Clinton was a good president. So think just for a second before I move on to the next slide. What are the implied premises here? They're all missing something. What is it? How would you fill it in? So I'll give you 4 or 5 seconds to think about that before I move on to the next slide. All right, so here are those statements, those arguments with the implied premise filled in. It is wrong to inflict anything on another person that the average person would find shocking. The average person would find torture shocking, so torture is wrong. Now, look, I don't know if this is a good argument. It's probably not, but at least now it makes sense. There's no longer this jump in the argument. Second one, redistributive taxation takes money from people without their consent. It is wrong to take money from people without their consent, so redistributive taxation is wrong. Again, maybe it's a good argument, maybe it's not, but at least it makes sense now. The missing premise is filled in. Final one, if the economy does well during a president's term, that person is a good president. The economy did well during Bill Clinton's term, so Bill Clinton was a good president. So notice, now you guys might have filled these arguments, the missing premises, in different ways. And that's kind of the dirty secret here, is that when there are missing premises, there often isn't one exact right or wrong way to fill it in. You'll have to, when you think an argument has an implied or missing premise, you'll have to try to come up with what you think is the most logical way, the most sensible way to fill the gap. And so if you came up with different missing premises for these, don't worry. It is a matter of judgment what the right way, what the wrong way to fill in implied or missing premises are. However, there are a few important things to think about how to fill in missing premises, and better and worse ways to do it. So the most important thing to think about when filling in missing premises in an argument that might have them is this so-called principle of charity. And the principle of charity is a bit more general than this. The principle of charity means when you're interpreting or putting back together somebody else's argument, you want to try to give them a good argument. In fact, you want to give them the best possible argument for their claims that you can. So why do this? Well, for a couple reasons. One, it's just basic respect. You would want somebody to assume that you have good reasons for what you believe, that you don't just think stupid things for stupid reasons, so you ought to return the favor to the other person. You shouldn't assume that the other person's stupid, so interpret their argument in a charitable way. Second, charity is important because we want to be able to have good conversations with others. We want to have arguments that might actually go somewhere. We want to, even if we think the other person's wrong, to learn from them, to understand why they think what they do. If you interpret my argument in a stupid way, you're not going to learn anything from it because, well, it's not going to be a very sensible argument the way you interpret it. And also, if we're having a conversation, really predictably, if you make me out to be an idiot, I'm going to get mad. I'm going to want just cut it off, stop talking. There is one final, maybe not so inspiring reason that the principle of charity is important. And that is, if you want to disprove what somebody's saying, if you want to give a good argument against their position because you think it's just completely wrong, well, the best way to do that is to be charitable. Well, why is that? Well, the reason is, if you take someone's argument and you make it into something stupid, they can just say, well, that's not what I mean. That's not right. But if you give them the best possible case and you can show it still doesn't work, that's a really powerful argument. It's really hard for the other person to reply. Okay, so how does this principle of charity work? Well, we can see it at work in the way we fill in people's arguments, the way we fill in missing premises sometimes. Here's an argument with some implied or missing premises. If bankers treat minority applicants differently, then the banking system is unfair. So the banking system is unfair. Obviously, there are some missing premises here. You just get a giant jump from this if statement to the statement that, the banking system is unfair. Well, how do we fill them in? Well, here's a really uncharitable way to fill in those premises. If all bankers treat minority applicants differently, then the banking system is unfair. All bankers are racists, so bankers treat minority applicants differently, so the banking system is unfair. See, this is uncharitable because I've given the person a premise that's not just false, all bankers are racists, but it's really easy to show that it's false, right? All I need to do, if I want to show that this is false, is find one banker who's not in fact a racist. I'm sure I could do that. Here's a more charitable way to fill the argument in. If many bankers treat minority applicants differently, then the banking system is unfair. Some bankers are racist, but many others have implicit biases against minority applicants. So many bankers treat minority applicants differently, so the banking system is unfair. Look, you might be convinced by this argument, you might not be, but notice it's a much better argument than the earlier one. 2, as compared to 2 in the other argument, well, maybe it's false, maybe it's true, but it's not so obviously false, it's not so easy to disprove as is the earlier statement. More likely to be true, more convincing argument. This is a much more charitable way to interpret that argument.